The night of July 21st, 1941, began like any other in Moscow, quiet, heavy with the heat of summer. But by midnight, the sky above the Soviet capital would burn. For the first time in the Great Patriotic War, the heart of Russia, the Kremlin, the cathedrals, the crowded boulevards of Moscow would come under direct attack. When the first German bombers appeared over the horizon, few in Moscow believed they could really reach the city. For weeks, Soviet propaganda had promised that not a single enemy plane will reach Moscow. The Red Army, it said, stood strong on the Western Front. Yet that night, the air itself betrayed them. From the western sky came the distant growl of engines. First a hum, then a roar. At 22:25, air raid sirens screamed through the capital. Searchlights cut through the darkness. The people of Moscow, nearly 4 million of them, rushed to shelters, to basements, to the underground stations newly built by Stalin's architects. Children were herded into tunnels lined with propaganda posters, now trembling on the walls. Above them, the German Luftwaffe had arrived. This was Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's vast invasion of the Soviet Union, entering its second month. The German army had already captured Minsk, Smolensk was under siege, and the road to Moscow seemed open. Hitler was convinced that the Soviet Union would collapse in a matter of weeks. He wanted to prove it, not only to his generals, but to the world. And so, on July 21st, he ordered the Luftwaffe to strike directly at the Soviet capital. It was not just a military target, it was psychological. Hitler believed that if the people of Moscow saw their city in flames, the Soviet regime would lose its grip. At 22:28, the first wave of 195 Heinkel and Dornier bombers crossed the outer defenses. Soviet radar stations picked them up too late. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire over the suburbs of Mozhaisk and Kaluga, but the Germans came in waves, high, fast, and deadly. In the Kremlin, Stalin was awake. He refused to go to the shelter beneath the complex. Witnesses would later recall him standing by a window, smoking in silence as the sky flashed with distant fire. His guards begged him to move. He didn't. The German bombers dropped nearly 100 tons of explosives and 45,000 incendiary bombs across Moscow. Fires broke out in Zamoskvorestia, near the old Arbat, around the Moscow River, and in the industrial zones to the north. The Central Telegraph Building was hit. A section of the Kremlin wall was damaged. The roof of the Bolshoi Theater caught fire. But the city did not burn the way Berlin or Warsaw had. Soviet firefighting brigades, trained in civil defense, moved with astonishing discipline. Thousands of volunteers, factory workers, students, even school children, formed human chains to pass buckets of water through the streets. Firefighters climbed rooftops under falling debris. Soldiers from the NKVD raced to defuse unexploded bombs, some still ticking as they were thrown into rivers or buried under sand. By dawn, Moscow was still standing. For the Germans, it was meant to be a triumph. Instead, it became Hitler's first true failure in the East. Of the nearly 200 bombers sent that night, 22 were shot down, a shocking loss for the Luftwaffe's best crews. Some were destroyed by flak, others, disoriented by smoke and anti-aircraft fire, crashed on their return route. The Soviets had managed to deploy over 1,000 anti-aircraft guns, more than 170 searchlights, and nearly 600 fighter aircraft from the 6th Air Defense Corps. The next morning, the people of Moscow emerged from their shelters. The city was bruised, scarred, but alive. Smoke still rose from the smoldering ruins, yet the Red Square, the very heart of the Soviet Union, stood untouched. Stalin ordered the radio to broadcast classical music throughout the day, the calm tones of Tchaikovsky and Glinka, to prove to the nation that Moscow endured. That same afternoon, he appeared on state radio for the first time since the invasion began. His words were measured, deliberate, heavy with meaning. The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours, but Hitler was not finished. In the days that followed, he ordered repeated air raids on July 22nd, July 23rd, and beyond. Yet each failed to break the city's defenses. For every plane lost, the Luftwaffe's confidence wavered. The Soviets, meanwhile, grew stronger. They began digging trenches around the city, building anti-tank fortifications, and training militia units composed of ordinary citizens. The bombing of July 21st had not broken Moscow. It had hardened it. But even as Moscow stood firm, the front was still collapsing to the west. Smolensk burned. Thousands of Soviet troops were encircled and captured, and the Wehrmacht, confident, relentless, prepared for its final push toward the Soviet capital. The battle for Moscow was only beginning. The smoke over Moscow had barely cleared when the next wave came. It was the night of July 22nd, barely 24 hours after the first air raid. The city was still repairing, burying, rebuilding. Yet the sound returned, that distant, unmistakable growl of engines in the night sky. The people of Moscow had no illusions this time. The sirens began to wail at 10:30 p.m., and the sky, still faintly glowing from the day's fires, was once again cut by white searchlight beams. Anti-aircraft gunners, already exhausted from the previous night, took their positions. Civilians hurried back underground. The streets emptied in minutes. From the west, the bombers came again. Heinkel He-11s, Junkers Ju-80s, and Dornier. Over 200 aircraft in tight formation. The Luftwaffe had chosen the same route, crossing the front line near Smolensk, flying through clouds to avoid detection. They believed Soviet air defenses had been crippled by the first raid. They were wrong. This time, the Soviet Air Defense Command was ready. New orders from Stalin had mobilized every remaining resource around the capital. Fighter squadrons of the 6th Air Defense Corps were stationed on the outskirts. Yak-1s, MiG-3s, and Lei-GG-3s waiting in the dark. When the German bombers reached Moscow's outer ring, they were met with a wall of anti-aircraft fire. Tracer rounds lit up the night like lightning. Soviet fighters climbed into the clouds, attacking from above and behind. The air turned into a battlefield of fire and steel. Yet still, the Germans broke through. Bombs fell once more on the Arbat, on the Kursk railway terminal, and on several industrial plants producing tanks and munitions. Fires spread quickly, fueled by the dry summer wind. Near the Kremlin, one incendiary bomb struck the Spasskaya Tower. Its red star, newly installed, was shattered by the blast. But the tower itself stood firm. At one point, debris fell dangerously close to Stalin's office. His guards again urged him to evacuate. Again he refused. One witness, the translator, Valentin Berezhkov, later recalled, he stood by the window motionless. The city was burning, but he watched as if measuring the cost of war itself. Through the night, the Soviets fought back with increasing coordination. Spotters on rooftops reported incoming waves by radio. Anti-aircraft batteries shifted positions dynamically to confuse the bombers. Even the city's river fleet joined the defense. Naval guns mounted on barges opened fire from the Moscow River, their shells whistling into the sky. By dawn, another 15 German planes had been destroyed, most by anti-aircraft fire. One bomber crashed in the Sokolniki district. Its wreckage later displayed publicly to show that Moscow's defenders could strike back. The psychological impact was immense. The people of Moscow had spent 2 nights under fire, and yet life resumed almost immediately. The tram lines reopened by morning. Workers returned to factories. Newspapers published photographs of the damage alongside headlines proclaiming, "The capital stands." For Hitler, this was infuriating. He had expected panic. The collapse of Soviet morale, the retreat of government offices, perhaps even Stalin fleeing the city. Instead, Moscow's resistance had become a symbol of Soviet endurance. On July 23rd, the Führer summoned Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring to his headquarters. The meeting was tense. Hitler demanded to know why Moscow still stood. Göring blamed weather, fuel shortages, and Soviet defenses. He promised that the next raids would finish the job. But within the ranks of the Luftwaffe, confidence was cracking. The long distances, poor intelligence, and the growing skill of Soviet defenders were taking a toll. Many pilots flying from captured airfields near Smolensk barely had enough fuel to reach Moscow and return. Some were lost simply due to navigation errors, crashing in forests or running out of fuel over enemy territory. Meanwhile, Soviet morale was transforming. What had begun as terror became defiance. The state newspapers published quotes from civilians. "We no longer fear the German planes. Let them come. Moscow will not fall." Posters appeared on walls showing the Kremlin surrounded by lightning with the slogan, "We defend the heart of the motherland." Children were taught to identify the sounds of German aircraft. Women joined fire brigades. University students trained as anti-aircraft observers. The government broadcast orchestral music during air raids to calm nerves. The sounds of symphonies blending with the echo of gunfire. For the first time, Moscow had become more than a capital. It had become a fortress. By the end of July, Hitler's bombers had dropped over 1,000 tons of explosives on Moscow. Yet the city refused to break. The Kremlin still stood. Stalin still ruled. And in the hearts of the Soviet people, something unbreakable had begun to take root. But to the west, the real threat was still coming. Smolensk had fallen. The German armies were regrouping, preparing for the advance toward Moscow that would decide the fate of the Eastern Front. The skies had failed to conquer the Soviet capital. Now Hitler turned to the ground. By early August 1941, the smoke from the bombing raids had thinned, but the fear had not vanished. The people of Moscow lived between two sounds: the hum of the city rebuilding itself and the distant thunder of war creeping ever closer from the west. The German armies had already reached the outskirts of Smolensk, barely 400 kilometers from Moscow. For the first time, the shadow of the Wehrmacht stretched across the horizon of the Soviet heartland. Yet despite the devastation from above, the capital still functioned. Trains rolled, newspapers printed, the Kremlin's flag still waved above the towers, scorched by shrapnel. Hitler had promised that Moscow would fall before the autumn rains. In Berlin, his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, assured the German people that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. "One more push," he said, "and the Slavic colossus will crumble." But inside the Führer's headquarters, frustration was growing. The Luftwaffe, once thought invincible, had failed to break Soviet morale. Intelligence reports from the Eastern Front painted a different picture, one of unexpected resistance, especially from the skies. The German pilots were discovering a brutal truth. The Soviet Air Force, though battered, was not destroyed. Dozens of new aircraft were being relocated east of Moscow, out of reach of the Luftwaffe's bombs. By late July, Soviet radar installations, primitive but functional, had begun to track enemy planes more effectively. The once vulnerable airspace over Moscow had become a deadly trap. One of the key figures behind this transformation was General Mikhail Gromadin, commander of Moscow's air defense. Working under Stalin's direct supervision, he reorganized anti-aircraft batteries into a tight network surrounding the city. Searchlights, spotter posts, and mobile guns created overlapping zones of fire. The German pilots began to call it the Ring of Hell. For every bomber that slipped through, 5 were forced to turn back. Still, the raids continued. From July through August, the Luftwaffe launched more than 300 sorties against Moscow. Most never reached the city. Those that did dropped their payloads into open fields or were scattered by Soviet flak before they could find their targets. One night, several bombs fell on the Kremlin itself. The golden domes of the cathedrals glowed with firelight, but the thick masonry walls held. Stalin, calm as ever, remained in his office. When his guards begged him again to move to a bunker, he replied simply, "If the Kremlin falls, I fall with it." The Soviet leadership, sensing an opportunity to rally the nation, turned the failure of the bombing into a weapon of propaganda. Pravda published headlines proclaiming Hitler's first defeat. Posters showed German bombers burning in the sky above the Kremlin. Radio Moscow broadcast the voice of announcer Yuri Levitan, declaring that the enemy sought to break the heart of the motherland, but the heart beats stronger than ever. These words mattered. For millions of civilians across the Soviet Union, the defense of Moscow became a symbol of hope. It proved that the Germans could be stopped, that their power was not endless. But beneath the triumphant headlines, the truth remained harsh. Over 1,000 civilians had died in the first 2 raids. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. Food was scarce. Fuel was rationed. Every night, the people slept in underground stations, their faces pale under dim electric lights. Mothers soothed children with lullabies as anti-aircraft guns thundered above. In those shelters, rumors spread quickly. Some said the Germans would march into Moscow by September. Others whispered that Stalin had evacuated in secret. But every morning, the city woke to the same sound: the voice of Levitan on the radio, reading Stalin's speeches. Moscow stands. The Red Army fights. We shall drive the enemy from our land. By mid-August, the Luftwaffe began to shift its strategy. The bombing of Moscow had achieved little beyond civilian terror and minor damage. The new objective, ordered by Hitler himself, was to destroy Soviet industry and encircle the Red Army's Western Front. That meant moving resources away from Moscow and toward the south, toward Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus. The Luftwaffe's Moscow squadrons were reassigned to support the drive toward Kiev and Bryansk. For a brief moment, the skies above Moscow fell quiet. But the silence was deceptive. In the fields and forests west of the capital, new airfields were being built, camouflaged beneath nets and trees. Soviet engineers worked day and night, building runways from planks and crushed stone. They knew the next battle would come not from the air, but from the ground. For Hitler, the failure to break Moscow from above was more than tactical. It was psychological. The man who believed himself invincible, who had crushed Paris, Warsaw, and Oslo, now faced a city that refused to burn. In a moment of rare honesty, General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his diary, "The enemy does not behave as expected. His morale, even under bombardment, is astonishing. This war is not like those before." As summer turned to autumn, the world watched the Eastern Front shift. The German armies pushed forward, confident that the Soviet resistance would eventually collapse. But the seeds of their failure had already been sown. In the skies over Moscow, where courage, not conquest, had decided the night, the capital still stood, its people still worked, and the fires that had once burned it now fueled its defiance. But Hitler was not done. If the skies could not take Moscow, then his armies would march upon it. The next phase of Operation Barbarossa had begun. By September 1941, the illusion of a quick German victory in the east had begun to fade. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion Hitler had called his lightning strike against Bolshevism, was slowing. The Soviet Union, battered but unbroken, was proving to be unlike any enemy the Wehrmacht had ever faced. Moscow, the prize of the campaign, still stood untouched by occupation. The bombing of July 21st had been meant to break it, to destroy its will, to frighten its people into chaos. Instead, it had done the opposite. The city had grown harder, colder, more determined. In Berlin, frustration was mounting. Hitler demanded explanations. He wanted to know why the Luftwaffe, the pride of the Reich, could devastate London but not Moscow. His generals blamed weather, distance, and Soviet defenses. But beneath the excuses lay a deeper problem. The German war machine was reaching the edge of its limits. The airfields supporting the bombing runs were hundreds of kilometers from Moscow. Supply lines stretched thin across the vast Russian steppe. Engines froze at night, sand clogged filters by day, and fuel shortages became critical. Even the most experienced pilots began to question whether the capital could ever be taken from the air. Meanwhile, in Moscow, life continued under the rhythm of air raid sirens and reconstruction. Every night, the city went dark. Windows were covered in paper. Streetlights were extinguished. The great capital of the Soviet Union vanished into the shadows. Anti-aircraft searchlights traced slow white circles across the sky, waiting for the next attack that might never come. The people adapted. They carried water from broken pipes, shared food with strangers, and listened to the radio as if it were the heartbeat of the nation. In the underground tunnels of the metro, tens of thousands slept side by side. A sense of unity, born from fear, bound them together. The Kremlin, still standing proud at the city's center, became a fortress. Its towers were camouflaged, its walls repainted to resemble ordinary buildings from the air. The Germans searched for it night after night, dropping bombs blindly, never realizing that the heart of the Soviet government was still right beneath their sights. Inside, Stalin worked almost without rest. His face grew pale, his eyes heavy, but he refused to leave the capital. Every day he received reports from the front. The Germans were advancing on Leningrad, closing in on Kiev, and approaching Vyazma. The map on his desk was filling with red arrows pushing toward Moscow. But Stalin's greatest weapon was time. He knew that winter was coming, and that Hitler's entire strategy depended on victory before the snow fell. The Soviet army could retreat and burn everything behind it, but Moscow could not move. It had to stand. In September, the Luftwaffe made one last attempt to regain the momentum it had lost in July. The plan was simple: to conduct a new wave of coordinated bombings against Moscow's railways and factories, cutting the city off from reinforcements and supplies. On the night of September 10th, more than 200 German bombers crossed the front line. They approached the city at low altitude, using the moonlight to navigate. But waiting for them was one of the most formidable air defense networks ever assembled. Over 1,000 anti-aircraft guns, more than 300 searchlights, and a ring of fighter squadrons surrounded Moscow like a steel halo. When the first bombs fell, the city's defenses erupted. The night sky turned white with tracer fire. Soviet pilots took off from hidden airstrips around the capital, climbing into the chaos. The battle above Moscow raged for hours. Dozens of German bombers were hit. Some fell blazing into the fields. Others limped back westward, engines smoking. When morning came, the damage to the city was minimal. A few warehouses burned, a factory was destroyed, but the Kremlin still stood, untouched. The German raid had failed again. For the people of Moscow, it was proof that their city could survive anything. Soviet newspapers announced the victory with quiet pride. The capital stands unshaken. But to the Germans, it was another sign that something was going terribly wrong. The Luftwaffe had spent enormous resources on the Moscow raids. Its crews were exhausted, its aircraft worn down. Yet Moscow remained, a living symbol of defiance that no bomb could erase. And far to the west, in Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg, a new obsession was taking shape. If the Luftwaffe could not destroy Moscow from the sky, then the Wehrmacht would destroy it from the ground. By late September, Hitler issued Directive Number 35, the order to begin Operation Typhoon, the grand assault on Moscow itself. 3 massive army groups would converge on the capital. Army Group Center from the west, supported by panzer divisions under Guderian and Hoth. The Luftwaffe would provide cover. The goal was total encirclement. It was the largest offensive of the entire campaign, a storm aimed directly at the Soviet heart. But the lessons of July 21st still hung in the air. The German High Command had underestimated Soviet resolve once. Now they would underestimate something else: the power of the Russian landscape itself. The autumn rains were coming. The roads would turn to mud, the fields to swamps. And behind every tree, every ruined village, the Red Army was waiting. The bombing of Moscow had been Hitler's first failure. What came next would become something far greater: the failure of his entire vision. In the coming months, the skies over Moscow would fall silent, but the ground would begin to shake. The largest land battle in history was about to begin, and with it, the fate of the war in the East. October 1941, the German army was closing in on Moscow. After months of unbroken advance, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. Entire Soviet armies had been surrounded and annihilated at Smolensk, Bryansk, and Vyazma. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners marched west, the road to the Soviet capital seemingly open. In Berlin, the propaganda machine roared with confidence. Hitler told his generals that within weeks, the Red Banner would fall from the Kremlin towers. The same city that had defied the bombers in July would now fall beneath the boots of the Reich. But in the shadows of the advancing panzers, the cost was already mounting. The roads were choked with mud. The Rasputitsa, the season of rain and ruin, had begun. Tanks sank to their hulls, horses collapsed in exhaustion, and fuel trucks stalled for days. The same vastness that had defeated Napoleon was now consuming Hitler's mechanized army. And still, the Luftwaffe tried to deliver what the soldiers could not. Its pilots fought to supply and support the advance, to scout Soviet defenses, to strike railway lines leading into Moscow. But every flight grew longer, every engine weaker. The Soviet Air Force, once shattered, had begun to recover. From the east came new planes, new pilots, new confidence. Inside Moscow, the people waited for the storm they knew was coming. The city was transforming itself into a fortress. Every street, every park, every square was being fortified. Civilians dug trenches by hand. Children carried sandbags to protect government buildings. Women built barricades while soldiers laid mines on the outskirts. Factories worked without pause, producing tanks, shells, and rifles. The sound of hammers and engines echoed through the night, mingling with the wail of air raid sirens. The city that Hitler believed would collapse in terror had become one enormous war machine. Yet beneath the defiance there was fear, the kind of quiet, suffocating fear that seeps into every breath. Rumors spread that the government was preparing to evacuate. People whispered that Stalin himself had fled. But one evening on October 19th, the voice of Stalin came over the radio. Calm, cold, unshaken. He announced that Moscow would not be abandoned, that the capital would stand. His words, delivered in that deep, deliberate voice, froze the panic that had begun to rise. "Comrade," he said, "we must defend every street, every house, every inch of our motherland." The next day, the German advance resumed. Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow, was underway. The Luftwaffe returned to the skies above the city for the first time since the summer. On the night of October 21st, waves of bombers approached from the west, but the defenses were ready. The entire sky erupted with flak. Soviet searchlights caught the bombers in their beams, and Yak and MiG fighters rose from nearby airfields to intercept. For hours, the battle raged above the capital. Explosions lit the clouds red. Tracers streaked like fiery veins across the darkness. Dozens of planes fell on both sides, but when dawn broke, the Kremlin still stood. The Soviet radio announced all enemy attacks repelled. Once again, the bombing of Moscow had failed. But on the ground, the German armies were drawing dangerously close. By early November, they had reached the town of Klin to the northwest and the outskirts of Tula to the south, within striking distance of the capital. The people of Moscow could hear the distant thunder of artillery. As snow began to fall, the city braced for siege. Barbed wire stretched across Red Square. Anti-tank obstacles, great metal crosses, lined the boulevards. Civilians were issued rifles. The metro tunnels were converted into command posts and hospitals. And then on November 7th, something extraordinary happened. Despite the danger, despite the bombs and the fear, Stalin ordered the annual parade to take place on Red Square, the traditional celebration of the October Revolution. At dawn, under a gray sky, soldiers marched past the Lenin Mausoleum while snow drifted through the air. Stalin stood on the reviewing platform, wrapped in his greatcoat, addressing the troops before they marched directly from the parade to the front line. His words were carried by loudspeakers across the square. "The enemy stands at the gates, but he will not pass. The spirit of our ancestors lives within us, the spirit that defeated Napoleon and will defeat Hitler." The scene became legend, the symbol of defiance that Hitler's bombs could not erase. That same night, German pilots again took to the sky. Their orders were to find and destroy the Kremlin. But the city, hidden beneath snow and blackout, seemed to vanish beneath them. Their bombs fell blindly on empty streets and frozen rivers. By morning, the attack had failed once more. As November gave way to December, the German advance stalled. The Wehrmacht had reached the very limits of its strength. Its tanks were frozen, its soldiers starving, its supply lines hundreds of kilometers long. The temperature dropped below -30 degrees, engines cracked, oil froze, and the soldiers' thin uniforms offered no protection from the cold. Hitler had promised that the war in the East would last only weeks. But now, as the snow buried his armies, the truth could no longer be denied. Moscow would not fall. The bombings of July 21st, 1941, had been the first sign, the warning that the Soviet capital would endure. Now that endurance was becoming reality. The failure of the Luftwaffe to crush Moscow's spirit mirrored the collapse of the entire German strategy. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was not advancing, but holding, not attacking, but freezing in place. And in that frozen stillness, something new was stirring on the other side of the lines. The Red Army was preparing to strike back. The bombers had failed. The siege had failed. But in the dead of winter, under skies once filled with fire, the Soviet counteroffensive was about to begin, and with it, the true turning point of the war. Winter had arrived, a brutal, merciless winter that no army had prepared for. The German Wehrmacht, once the unstoppable force that had swept across Europe, now stood frozen before Moscow. What had begun as Operation Barbarossa, the greatest invasion in history, had ground to a halt. The dream of parading through Red Square, of raising the swastika above the Kremlin, had vanished beneath the snow. The same city that Hitler had promised to burn now stood defiant, cloaked in frost and silence. The first signs of German weakness came quietly. Reports filtered through the front, engines refusing to start, rifles jamming in the cold, soldiers collapsing from frostbite. Horses, as the backbone of German logistics, began to die in the thousands. Supply lines stretched over 500 miles of frozen steppe, and every mile was a graveyard of broken trucks and abandoned artillery. In Berlin, Hitler refused to accept reality. He raged at his generals, accusing them of cowardice. The Luftwaffe was ordered to resume bombing Moscow, even as the temperatures plunged to -40. Pilots struggled to start their aircraft. Their oxygen lines froze. Their fuel congealed in the tanks. Many never reached their targets. But those who did found a city transformed. Moscow was no longer the same city they had bombed in July. Its defenses were stronger, its skies thicker with flak. Soviet radar and searchlights, primitive by Western standards but deadly effective, blanketed the capital. Anti-aircraft batteries surrounded the Kremlin, and fighter patrols took off from hidden airstrips beyond the city. When the German bombers crossed the night sky, they were met with storms of fire. Explosions rippled through the clouds. One Luftwaffe pilot described the sight in his journal. The city glowed faintly beneath us, a web of shadows and light. Then the guns opened up, and the sky became a furnace. We could see the black shapes of our planes falling, and then nothing. In Moscow, the people no longer ran to the shelters. They had lived through months of raids and knew the patterns of the sirens, the thud of distant bombs. Some stood on rooftops watching the tracers streak across the heavens, as if the fate of their city were being written in light. Every night, teams of firemen, soldiers, and civilians fought the aftermath. They dragged hoses through the snow, dug survivors from the rubble, and stamped out the flames that licked at the edges of the great city. Yet through it all, the Kremlin's golden stars continued to burn above them, a sign, they believed, that Moscow still lived. Far to the west, at the front, German soldiers wrote desperate letters home. "It is colder than I have ever known," one wrote. "We are buried in snow. The Russians keep coming. The city is there. We can see its glow on the horizon. But it feels as if it belongs to another world." That world, for the German soldiers, was slipping away. On December 5, 1941, after weeks of waiting, the Soviet counterattack began. Fresh divisions, Siberian troops hardened by years of winter training, struck the frozen German lines north and south of Moscow. They came in white camouflage, moving silently through snowdrifts, supported by T-34 tanks that still rumbled forward when German engines froze solid. For the first time since the invasion began, the Red Army advanced. The German troops, exhausted and starving, could not hold. Entire divisions fell back in disarray. The myth of invincibility shattered. Hitler's war machine, which had conquered half of Europe in a year, was now retreating from the gates of Moscow. The Luftwaffe tried once more to stem the tide. Bombers flew in daylight, strafing Soviet columns, but their numbers were too few and their targets too many. The Red Air Force, once decimated, now swarmed the skies with Yak and Lag fighters, reclaiming dominance. The great aerial power of Germany was being matched and beaten. In the Kremlin, Stalin received reports of victory with grim satisfaction. He did not celebrate. He simply nodded and issued new orders. Push them back. The people of Moscow emerged from their shelters to see the city still standing. The spires of the Kremlin were dusted in snow, the streets scarred by months of war. But it was theirs. The bells rang again. For the first time since the summer, light returned to the city's windows. The Germans had failed. The capital of the Soviet Union had endured the unendurable. And for Hitler, the defeat at Moscow was not just a military setback, it was an omen. His promise of swift victory in the East had been broken. The war he had intended to finish in months would now drag on for years. Historians would later call it the turning point of the Second World War. The moment when the tide began to shift, when the German juggernaut met something it could not crush, the will of a nation that refused to die. But on that freezing December night, no one knew how long the road ahead would be. The only certainty was that Hitler's first failure had come not in the snows of 1943, nor in the ruins of Berlin, but here, above the burning city he had vowed to destroy. The bombs had fallen, the city had burned, and still Moscow stood. The wind over the Volga carried the sound of distant sirens, fading into silence. For the first time, it was not the enemy's silence. It was peace, fragile, momentary, but real. And from that silence would rise something far greater, the long, brutal struggle that would turn the course of history. The defeat before Moscow in the winter of 1941-42 marked a turning point, not just in the campaign, but in the entire course of the war. For the first time, the German army had been stopped, and not by some distant enemy, not by politics or delay, but by sheer resistance, by the will of a nation that refused to surrender, and by a land that devoured invaders as it had done for centuries. The men of the Wehrmacht, who had once marched in triumph through Warsaw and Paris, now dug trenches in frozen soil outside the Soviet capital. Their great advance had collapsed. The same soldiers who believed they would celebrate Christmas in the Kremlin now huddled in makeshift shelters, wrapped in rags, burning scraps of wood to survive. The temperature plunged to -40. Fuel froze in tanks, rifles jammed, and men's breath turned to ice before it left their lips. Horses died standing. The cold did not discriminate. It killed without sound, without mercy. The German army was in retreat. The Red Army, reinvigorated by Siberian reinforcements and by the first glimmer of hope since June, pressed forward with fury. Villages once held by the Germans were retaken in brutal close-quarters combat. Frozen fields became graveyards. In Berlin, the news was unthinkable. Hitler, humiliated by the failure of his great offensive, refused to allow any withdrawal. His generals warned him that to stand and fight in the cold was suicide. But Hitler's pride was greater than reason. The German soldier must not retreat, he said. He must stand and die where he is. And so they did. Thousands perished, not from battle, but from exposure, disease, and exhaustion. Those who survived would remember it as the winter that broke the myth of the invincible German army. The Luftwaffe, too, was suffering. The great bombers that had once rained destruction on Europe were grounded by ice and shortage. Their crews froze in their cockpits. Aircraft engines refused to start even with fires lit beneath them. By January 1942, the once proud air fleet that had terrified Europe was fighting simply to stay alive. In Moscow, life crept back slowly. Streetcars ran again. Bread rations increased, though barely. People returned to their jobs, their schools, their factories. The city's scars were still raw. Whole districts lay in ruins. But it breathed again. Stalin, whose decision to remain in the capital during the siege had become legend, was hailed as the savior of Moscow. The propaganda machine declared the defense of the city as a triumph of socialism, of unity, of faith in the Soviet cause. Yet behind the speeches and parades, the losses were staggering. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers had fallen in the defense of the capital. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. But what mattered most was not who had died. It was that the city had lived. The bombing of July 21, 1941, once hailed by Hitler as the beginning of Moscow's destruction, was now remembered in the Soviet Union as the night the capital found its strength. The flames that had licked at its heart had not consumed it. They had forged it. A German pilot captured after the battle later recalled, "We believed Moscow would fall like Paris. We thought we were gods in the air. But over that city, everything changed. We flew through walls of light, fire, and smoke. They were everywhere, searchlights, flak, fighter planes. It was as if the sky itself was fighting us." The Soviets immortalized that battle in art, in song, in legend. Writers and composers turned the defense of Moscow into a national epic. For them, it was proof that the spirit of the Russian people could not be bombed out of existence. Yet behind the triumph was a darker truth. The battle had revealed the true cost of Hitler's war, not just to his enemies, but to Germany itself. By failing to take Moscow in 1941, Hitler lost more than a city. He lost the chance to end the war on his terms. His armies had burned through men, fuel, and faith. The Soviet Union had survived its worst moment, and in doing so, had bought time. Time to rebuild, to rearm, and to prepare for the counter-offensive that would eventually drive the Germans all the way back to Berlin. The failure of the bombing campaign had also exposed the limits of air power. The Luftwaffe's defeat in the skies over Moscow was a warning of what was to come. From the factories of Stalingrad to the ruins of Berlin, the German Air Force would never again dominate the skies as it once had. And as the snows melted in the spring of 1942, both sides prepared for what they knew would be another year of unimaginable bloodshed. For Hitler, the humiliation demanded revenge. He turned his attention south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad, a new name that would soon eclipse all others in the history of war. For Stalin, Moscow was now sacred ground. It had withstood the storm and emerged alive. The soldiers who had defended it were celebrated as heroes. Those who fell were buried beneath the frozen earth that they had refused to surrender. A Soviet broadcast from early 1942 declared, "Moscow stands. The German has met his first defeat. He came with fire and left with frost. He will return, but we will be ready." And they were. The bombing of Moscow, Hitler's first failure, was no longer just a military event. It was a symbol, a moment when the tide began to turn, when the idea of Nazi invincibility began to crumble. From that night forward, the world understood something new, that the German war machine, for all its power, could bleed. The sky above Moscow was clear now. The stars, once hidden by smoke and fire, shone over a city that had survived the unthinkable. And as the people slept, the ruins beneath them whispered the truth, that the war was far from over, but the balance had shifted forever. By the spring of 1942, the scars of the failed campaign around Moscow were still visible across both armies and across Europe itself. What had begun as Hitler's most ambitious offensive had ended in a disaster he could neither admit nor fully comprehend. The German high command blamed the weather, the lack of supplies, even their own generals. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. Moscow had been the first time Germany had met a wall it could not break. In the ruins left behind, Soviet workers began to rebuild. The city that had burned in the summer of 1941 now prepared for another assault that never came. Air raid sirens still sounded, but the rhythm of life slowly returned. Children walked to school past buildings pockmarked by shrapnel. Women stood in food lines that stretched for blocks. Soldiers limped through snow-covered squares, heading back to the front. Moscow was alive, battered, scarred, but alive. Hitler, however, could not let go of his obsession with the Soviet capital. In his speeches and meetings, he still spoke of Moscow as if it were the beating heart of the enemy, a symbol that had to be destroyed for Germany to win. "Once Moscow falls," he told his generals, "the Soviet Union will collapse like a house of cards." But reality no longer bent to his will. His army had been broken by a combination of Soviet endurance and his own arrogance. In the spring thaw, the German army found itself trapped in mud once again. The same deep, clinging Russian mud that had slowed Napoleon's legions more than a century earlier. Supply trucks sank to their axles. Horses starved. The front was littered with abandoned equipment. German engineers called the landscape the Sea of Mud. It was more than just terrain, it was a force of nature, as if the land itself was rejecting the invader. While the Wehrmacht struggled to hold its ground, Soviet morale began to rise. The victory at Moscow was the first true turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, a psychological victory that proved the Red Army could fight and win. Stalin knew it, and he made sure the world knew it too. His speeches, broadcast by radio across the Soviet Union, framed the battle as proof that fascism could be defeated. "The enemy wanted to take our capital," he said. "Instead, they found their grave." But even as Moscow celebrated its survival, the cost became clear. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured in the defense of the city. Tens of thousands of civilians had perished in the bombings. Entire neighborhoods were wiped from the map. For the survivors, victory felt hollow. a triumph of endurance over annihilation. Still, Stalin's confidence grew. He demanded new offensives, counterattacks to drive the Germans back before they could recover. His generals warned that the army needed time to rest, but he would not wait. The war had become not just a battle for territory, but a struggle of wills. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler and his inner circle plotted their next move. If Moscow could not be taken, then perhaps another blow, one just as devastating, could crush the Soviet Union from another direction. He turned his gaze southward, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, and toward a name that would soon be burned into history: Stalingrad. But before he launched that new campaign, Hitler ordered renewed air raids against Moscow. Though his armies could not reach the city by land, he still believed he could destroy it from the sky. On the night of May 9, 1942, German bombers once again appeared over Moscow. Their engines droned through the darkness, their bomb bays opening over the city. But the Soviet defenses had evolved. Dozens of new searchlights crisscrossed the sky. Anti-aircraft guns fired in synchronized bursts. Soviet night fighters took off from hidden airstrips, climbing into the dark. What followed was chaos, a battle not of armies, but of fire and shadows. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 30 bombers that night, many shot down before they even reached the target. One pilot, captured after parachuting into a forest east of the city, later said, "We were not attacking a city. We were flying into a storm of light and death." The raid failed. Moscow was barely scratched. Hitler's revenge from the air became another humiliation, a ghostly echo of that first bombing in July 1941. As months passed, the war grew larger, more complex, and far bloodier. What had begun as a single front in the east now stretched thousands of kilometers, from Leningrad in the north to the Caucasus Mountains in the south. The German war machine was stretched thin, its soldiers fighting in swamps, deserts, and snowdrifts. For the Soviet Union, the survival of Moscow meant everything. It was not just the capital, it was the heart of the nation, the center of command, the symbol of resistance. Soviet artists, writers, and filmmakers began to immortalize the defense of the city, transforming tragedy into legend. Posters showed Moscow rising from the flames. Songs were written about the soldiers who had stood against the German advance. In schools, children learned about the night the city refused to die. But the people themselves, those who had lived through it, remembered a different kind of story. They remembered the silence after the bombs fell, the sound of boots in the snow, the faces of those who did not return. For them, the bombing of July 21, 1941, was not only a victory, it was a wound that would never fully heal. And yet, out of that wound came something enduring, the first proof that Hitler could be stopped, that his empire of fire and fear was not eternal, that even the mightiest machine could break when faced with a nation that refused to kneel. The world had changed since that summer night when the first bombs fell on Moscow. Hitler's war, once thought unstoppable, was beginning to unravel. The illusion of German supremacy was gone. And though the fighting would rage for 3 more terrible years, the seeds of his downfall had been sown in the smoke above the Soviet capital. The bombing of Moscow was meant to be a message, a show of power, a declaration that nothing could stand before the Reich. Instead, it became a warning, a sign that the tide of war could turn, that courage could outlast fear, and that even in the darkest nights the human will could endure. By the time 1943 dawned, Moscow stood firm, battered but unbroken, its skyline marked by domes and smokestacks instead of flames. The night sky that had once burned with the glow of German incendiaries now shimmered with searchlights of victory celebrations. Across the Soviet Union, word spread that Hitler's great gamble in the East had failed. Moscow, the city he had promised to crush within weeks, remained free. But survival came at a staggering cost. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet civilians were dead. Entire districts of the city were reduced to ash. Families were torn apart. Fathers at the front, mothers in factories, children evacuated by train to the Urals. The city's heartbeat continued, but it beat slower, heavier, burdened by memory. The bombing of July 21, 1941, had been intended as a message. Hitler's thunderous declaration that Moscow would soon fall. Instead, it became the spark that united an entire nation in defiance. The Germans had believed that Soviet morale would collapse under terror, but the result was the opposite. For every bomb that fell, more citizens joined the defense. For every building destroyed, a dozen men and women picked up shovels, rifles, or tools to rebuild. In those first weeks of war, when Luftwaffe bombers screamed over the Kremlin and explosions painted the horizon red, Moscow's people had expected death. What they found instead was resolve. The city transformed into a fortress. Anti-aircraft guns were mounted on rooftops. Trenches were dug in parks and boulevards. Statues were covered in sandbags. Museum treasures hidden deep underground. Stalin himself refused to leave the capital, declaring, "Moscow will not be surrendered." That decision was more than symbolic. It rallied a nation that had seen its armies pushed back thousands of kilometers. If the leader stayed, so would the people. Even as fires burned in the distance, the Kremlin's clock tower continued to chime every hour, a sound that reminded everyone that Moscow still lived. By 1943, the Germans had long since lost their chance to take the city. The front had moved hundreds of kilometers west, toward the fields of Kursk and the ruins of Smolensk. Yet in Hitler's war councils, the failure to capture Moscow remained a shadow that hung over every operation. He refused to admit defeat, even to himself. His generals knew it. One of them, General Heinz Guderian, would later write, "The turning point was not Stalingrad, it was Moscow." There we learned that the war was no longer ours to win. Still, the Germans tried to rewrite the story. Propaganda broadcasts insisted that the bombing of Moscow had crippled Soviet industry, that the Red Army was barely surviving. But intelligence reports told a different tale. The Soviets had evacuated their factories eastward, beyond the Urals, and production was booming. Tanks, planes, and guns were being built faster than ever. The bombing that was meant to destroy Moscow's strength had, paradoxically, helped forge it. It united the Soviet people under a single burning idea: survival through defiance. Inside the city, life adapted to war. Trains arrived daily from the front, carrying the wounded and the weary. Women replaced men in factories, operating machines in temperatures below freezing. Children collected scrap metal for ammunition. Radio broadcasts filled the air with music and poetry meant to keep spirits alive. The voice of announcer Yuri Levitan, reading Soviet communique, became a symbol of endurance, calm, firm, unshakable. And through it all, the memory of that first bombing raid lingered. The sound of sirens in the dark, the thud of falling bombs, the trembling of windows. It was the night Moscow faced extinction and refused to die. Years later, historians would argue about whether Hitler ever truly intended to capture Moscow in 1941, or whether his obsession with Ukraine and the Caucasus diverted him from his goal. But in truth, his failure over Moscow was more than a tactical mistake. It was a psychological one. He underestimated the will of his enemy. He believed that Soviet Russia was a house of cards, held together by fear and ideology. He was wrong. Moscow's survival proved that the Soviet Union was not simply a state. It was a people bound by history, hardship, and a fierce sense of destiny. For them, the defense of the city was not only about land, but about existence itself. As the Red Army advanced westward, reclaiming the cities that had fallen months earlier, the story of Moscow became legend. Soviet newspapers called it the miracle of the capital. Western allies, stunned by the resilience of the Soviet defense, began to send more aid through the Lend-Lease program, tanks, planes, and supplies that would soon turn the tide further. The world had seen what few thought possible, that Hitler's war machine could be stopped. The man who had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, France, and the Balkans in a matter of months had now been halted by a city he thought would fall in a week. And yet, for those who lived through that night, the night of July 21st, 1941, the memory was not of triumph, but of terror. Survivors would later describe the sky turning red as if the heavens themselves were burning. They spoke of the distant roar of engines, the wailing of sirens, the trembling of the ground. And amid the chaos, they remembered the quiet that followed, the eerie silence when the last bomb had fallen, when only the snow drifted down over the smoking ruins. That silence was the moment Moscow realized it had endured. The bombing of Moscow was not Hitler's first mistake, but it was his first failure. It shattered the illusion of invincibility that had carried the Third Reich across Europe. It revealed the limits of power, the danger of arrogance, and the strength of a people who refused to yield. As history turned toward the brutal years that followed, Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin, the memory of that first night remained, a quiet symbol of resistance. The flames that once threatened to consume Moscow had instead lit the path to victory. As the smoke of war finally cleared over Europe in 1945, the city that Hitler had sworn to erase from the map still stood, scarred, changed, but unconquered. Moscow had not only survived, it had endured to become a symbol of everything his empire could not destroy. The bombing of July 21, 1941, had been meant as an opening act of terror, a prelude to conquest. Yet it became the beginning of Hitler's long descent into failure. The man who believed he could break a nation with bombs learned that he had awakened something far greater: the will of a people who refused to bow. In the aftermath of the first air raid, the Soviets counted the cost. Hundreds of fires had burned across Moscow that night. The Cathedral of Christ the Savior had been hit. Apartment blocks turned to ash. Dozens lay dead, hundreds wounded. Yet even as the fires still smoldered, work began to rebuild. Civilians filled the streets with buckets of water, shovels, and bare hands. Fire brigades battled the flames through the night. By dawn, the air raid sirens were silent, replaced by the sound of hammers and axes. The city's resilience was immediate, instinctive. Stalin appeared on the radio the next day, addressing the nation with a voice that trembled neither with fear nor pity. "Comrade," he said, "Moscow lives, Moscow fights." The message spread like wildfire across the Soviet Union. From Leningrad to the Caucasus, from the Baltic to the Urals, the people took heart. If the capital could endure the fury of Hitler's bombers, then perhaps the nation could endure the war. In Berlin, the story was different. The Luftwaffe reported success. Fires visible from miles away. The heart of Bolshevism struck. Hitler smiled for the cameras, convinced the Soviet capital was already collapsing. But in the offices of the German High Command, reality was harder to hide. Reconnaissance photographs showed minimal damage to key industrial and military targets. The Kremlin still stood. The city's defenses remained intact. What the Germans had expected to be a swift victory had become a war of endurance, one they were not prepared to fight. By autumn, the skies over Moscow filled again with the sound of engines. Night after night, German bombers returned, hoping to finish what they had begun. But the Soviet air defense network had grown stronger. Anti-aircraft batteries, once scattered and undertrained, now formed deadly rings around the city. Searchlights sliced through the clouds, locking onto aircraft that glinted like ghosts against the moonlight. The first Soviet radar systems, crude but effective, guided interceptors into position. For the first time since the start of the war, the Luftwaffe met real resistance. Bombers fell in flames. Pilots were captured. The illusion of German air supremacy began to crumble. A German pilot who survived a raid over Moscow later wrote in his journal, "We were told that Russia was finished, that the city would burn like Warsaw or Rotterdam. But as we approached, the sky lit up with fire from below. It was not a dying city. It was alive, angry, unbroken. I knew then that we had been lied to." Inside Moscow, life continued under siege. Every night, citizens moved underground into the metro stations, which had been converted into shelters. There, entire families slept among marble columns and mosaic ceilings. The grandeur of the Soviet state turned into a refuge. The walls shook with the sound of bombs above, but the people sang to drown it out. Songs of hope, of love, of survival. In the mornings, they returned to the surface to find new craters, new ruins, and began again. Factories resumed production within hours of bombardment. The Moscow metro itself was used to transport ammunition. Newspapers printed by candlelight carried words of defiance. "The enemy will not pass." The Germans had expected fear. What they found was faith. Faith in endurance, in purpose, in the belief that even the smallest act of resistance could mean survival. As winter came, the city turned white once more. Snow covered the rubble, softened the scars, and reminded everyone of that first night in July when the world had seemed to end. The cold became an ally now, turning the ground to steel and slowing the invaders' advance. When the German offensive stalled outside Moscow in December 1941, the Red Army struck back. The Battle of Moscow began, the largest counteroffensive of the war so far. Millions of men clashed on the frozen plains west of the city, and when it was over, the impossible had happened. Hitler's armies had been pushed back. The myth of invincibility shattered. The bombing of Moscow had been meant as a prologue to victory. It became instead the first crack in the foundation of the Third Reich. In the years that followed, the city rebuilt itself piece by piece. Streets once filled with rubble were paved anew. Parks bloomed where craters had been. The people who had lived through that first bombardment carried its memory quietly, speaking of it only in fragments. The sound of sirens, the heat of burning buildings, the strange stillness that followed. And yet, for all its horror, that night became sacred, not as a tragedy, but as a testament. The night Moscow refused to break. When the war finally ended in 1945, Soviet newspapers called it the triumph of endurance. In Red Square, victory parades marched past the same Kremlin walls that had once been targeted by Luftwaffe bombs. The flag of the Soviet Union fluttered above, untorn, defiant. In Germany, the bombing of Moscow became a footnote, one of many failed operations in a war of hubris and overreach. But to historians, it remains something far greater. It marks the moment when Hitler's vision of total conquest collided with reality. The first time he discovered that willpower alone could not overcome the vastness of the East, the depth of its winter, or the resilience of its people. July 21st, 1941, a date meant to mark terror and triumph, became the day of awakening. The night the skies above Moscow burned, and the course of the war began to shift. From the ashes of that raid, a truth emerged, that a nation's strength lies not in its armies, but in its people, in those who rebuild after the bombs fall, who stand guard when the night is darkest, who believe that endurance is its own kind of victory. The bombers are gone now. The fires are out. The city stands, alive, vast, its lights gleaming on the waters of the Moskva River. And when the winter wind passes through Red Square, it carries with it the echo of that long-ago night, the hum of engines, the tremor of distant thunder, and the quiet heartbeat of defiance that still endures. Moscow did not fall, and in that survival, the fate of the war and of the world was forever changed. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.